The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood quietly outside the oak doors of the family dining room. She could hear the familiar sound of her husband's voice, firm and measured, speaking to their eldest son. The tone made her pause, her hand hovering over the brass handle as she listened to the conversation unfolding within. "George, you must understand that your position comes with responsibilities that other children your age simply don't have," William's voice carried clearly through the heavy wood. "When you're out in public, you represent not just yourself, but our entire family and the monarchy itself." Catherine's heart tightened as she heard their 10-year-old son respond in a small voice, "Yes, Papa. I understand." "Do you? Because yesterday at the polo match, you were running around with the other children, laughing loudly and getting your clothes dirty. That's not behavior befitting a future king." Through the slight gap in the door, Catherine could see George sitting straight in his chair, his shoulders squared in a way that seemed too formal for a child his age. His breakfast sat largely untouched before him, the eggs growing cold as he focused intently on his father's words. "I was just playing, Papa. The other children were playing too. But you are not like other children, George. The sooner you accept that, the better prepared you'll be for your future role. A future king cannot afford to be seen as ordinary or undisciplined." Catherine felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. These conversations had become increasingly frequent over the past year, as George approached his 11th birthday. William had grown more insistent about preparing their son for the weight of his destiny, but Catherine couldn't help feeling that something precious was being lost in the process. She remembered her own childhood, filled with laughter and spontaneous moments of joy. Her parents had been loving but normal, allowing her and her siblings to experience the simple pleasures of being children without the weight of expectation that now seemed to press so heavily on George's young shoulders. "Your grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, understood duty from a very young age," William continued. "She knew that personal desires must always come second to the needs of the crown. This is a lesson you must learn now, while you're still young enough to adapt." Catherine pushed the door open gently, her maternal instincts overriding her usual deference to William's parenting decisions. "Good morning," she said softly, her eyes immediately finding George's face. The relief that flickered across his features when he saw her made her heart ache. "Mummy." George's formal posture relaxed slightly, though he remained seated as he'd been taught. William looked up, his expression shifting from the stern authority he'd been displaying to something softer, though still serious. "Catherine, I was just explaining to George the importance of maintaining proper decorum during public appearances." "I see," Catherine replied, moving to stand behind George's chair, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. She could feel the tension in his small frame, the way he seemed to hold himself as if constantly preparing for correction or criticism. "Perhaps we could discuss this further later," she suggested, her tone carefully neutral. "George needs to finish his breakfast before his tutoring session." William studied her face for a moment, and she could see the conflict there. He loved their son deeply, she knew that, but his own upbringing and the weight of his future responsibilities seemed to drive every decision he made regarding George's education and development. Of course, William agreed, though his tone suggested the conversation was merely postponed, not concluded. "George, remember what we've discussed. I expect you to think about it carefully." As William left the room, Catherine moved to sit beside her son, her hand finding his smaller one across the polished table. "How are you feeling this morning, sweetheart?" George looked up at her with eyes that seemed too old for his young face. "I'm fine, Mummy. Papa's right, isn't he? I do need to be better." The simple acceptance in his voice broke something inside Catherine. "George, you're already wonderful just as you are. You don't need to be better, you need to be yourself." "But, Papa says I can't just be myself. He says I have to be what the people need me to be." Catherine struggled to find the right words. How could she explain to her son that while William's intentions came from love and duty, there had to be room for childhood, for mistakes, for the simple joy of being young? How could she help him understand that becoming a good king didn't require losing himself entirely? Your papa wants to prepare you for important things, she said carefully. But, being prepared doesn't mean you can't still be a little boy who likes to play and laugh and get his clothes dirty sometimes. George's eyes brightened slightly. Really? Really? Some of the greatest leaders in history were people who remembered how to connect with others, how to find joy in simple things, how to be human. Over the following days, Catherine found herself observing the dynamic between father and son with growing concern. Every interaction seemed to be a teaching moment for William, every casual comment an opportunity to instill the gravity of George's future role. She watched as her son grew more careful with his words, more conscious of his every movement, more hesitant to express spontaneous joy or enthusiasm. During a family walk through the gardens at their Norfolk home, Anmer Hall, Catherine witnessed a moment that crystallized her fears. George had been walking quietly beside his father, discussing his history lessons, when he spotted a family of rabbits near the hedge. His face lit up with the natural excitement of a child seeing something delightful, and he took an involuntary step toward them. George, William's voice stopped him immediately. Remember what we discussed about maintaining composure. The light in George's eyes dimmed, and he returned to his father's side, resuming their serious conversation about the Tudor monarchs as if the moment of childish wonder had never occurred. That evening, after George had been tucked into bed, Catherine found herself in their private sitting room with William, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. I'd been thinking about our approach with George, she began carefully, choosing her words with the same diplomatic precision she'd learned to use in public appearances. William looked up from the government papers he'd been reviewing. What about it? I'm concerned that we might be asking too much of him too soon. Catherine, he's going to be king one day. We can't protect him from that reality forever. I'm not suggesting we protect him from it. I'm suggesting we allow him to grow into it gradually, naturally. William set down his papers, his attention fully focused on her now. My grandmother became queen when she was 25, but she'd been preparing for that role her entire life. Every moment of her childhood was shaped by the understanding of what lay ahead. And, look at the cost of that, Catherine replied gently. Your grandmother was extraordinary, but she also spoke often about the loneliness, the sacrifice, the weight of never being able to simply be herself. That's the reality of our position. But, it doesn't have to be George's reality, at least not yet. He's 10 years old, William. He should be worried about school tests and whether his friends like him, not about representing the monarchy every moment of every day. William was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful but troubled. You think I'm being too hard on him? It wasn't a question, and Catherine could hear the hurt beneath the statement. She moved to sit beside him on the sofa, taking his hand in hers. I think you love him so much that you're trying to protect him by preparing him for everything at once. But, childhood isn't just about preparation for the future, it's also about experiencing joy and wonder and making mistakes while the consequences are still small. And, what if those small mistakes become habits? What if by allowing him to be carefree now, we're setting him up to fail when he really needs to succeed? Catherine could see the fear that drove William's strictness, the weight of his own experiences and the pressure he felt to ensure George was ready for a role that had shaped William's entire life. What if by not allowing him to be carefree now, we're setting him up to be a king who doesn't understand the people he's meant to serve? What if we're creating someone who's technically perfect but emotionally disconnected? The question hung between them, and Catherine could see William considering it seriously. This was one of the things she loved most about her husband, his willingness to genuinely consider perspectives that challenged his own beliefs. I remember my own childhood, William said slowly. The constant awareness that everything I did was being watched, analyzed, judged. I remember wanting so desperately to just be normal, to have friends who saw me as just William, not as a prince. And, do you want that same feeling of isolation for George? No, William admitted. But, I also don't want him to be unprepared when the world starts demanding more of him. Catherine squeezed his hand. Then, maybe we need to find a balance. Maybe we can teach him about duty and responsibility while also allowing him to experience the joy and freedom of childhood. As they talked late into the night, Catherine felt a glimmer of hope that they might be able to find a path forward that honored both the demands of George's future role and his present needs as a young boy. But she also knew that changing deeply ingrained patterns of thinking and behavior would not be easy, especially when those patterns were driven by love and genuine concern for their son's future success. The following morning brought new challenges that would test their resolve and their ability to work together in navigating the complex terrain of raising a future king while preserving the heart of the child he still was. The crisis came unexpectedly, as family crises often do, during what should have been a peaceful Saturday morning. Catherine had taken George and his younger siblings, Charlotte and Louis, to a local farmer's market in Norfolk, hoping to give them a taste of normal family life away from the formality of palace routines. It was exactly the kind of outing that William had been questioning lately, but Catherine believed these moments of normalcy were essential for their children's development. George had been unusually quiet during the drive, and Catherine noticed how he kept glancing around nervously as they walked through the market stalls. Even in this relaxed setting, she could see the weight of his father's recent lessons pressing down on him. He walked with careful, measured steps, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that looked painfully formal for a 10-year-old boy exploring a market full of colorful vegetables and homemade crafts. "Look, George," Catherine said gently, pointing to a stall selling fresh strawberries. "These look delicious. Would you like to try one?" George looked at the strawberries with obvious longing, but hesitated. "Should I? Papa says I need to be careful about eating in public where people might see." Catherine's heart ached at the careful consideration in his young voice. "It's perfectly fine to enjoy a strawberry, sweetheart. That's what markets are for." As George tentatively accepted a sample from the friendly vendor, Catherine watched his face light up with simple pleasure. It was a reminder of how naturally joyful he could be when not constrained by constant awareness of his future role. Charlotte, who was 8 and still blissfully unconscious of most royal protocols, had been chattering happily with the market vendors, asking dozens of questions about how vegetables grew and whether the sheep she could see in a nearby field were happy. Her spontaneous curiosity and genuine delight in everything around her stood in stark contrast to George's careful composure. The moment that changed everything happened at a stall selling handmade toys. Louis, who was 5 and still young enough to escape most of William's formal expectations, had spotted a wooden knight on horseback and was examining it with the intense focus that only small children could bring to something that captured their imagination. "Mummy, look!" Louis called out. "It's just like the knights in my storybook." George moved closer to look at the toy, and Catherine could see genuine interest flickering in his eyes. The wooden knight was beautifully crafted, with intricate details carved into the armor and horse. "It's wonderful, isn't it?" Catherine encouraged, hoping to see more of that spark of childhood interest. "Yes," George said quietly, then added with the kind of adult consideration that broke Catherine's heart, "But Papa would say it's important not to seem too interested in toys where people might be watching." The vendor, an elderly man with kind eyes, had been listening to this exchange with growing confusion. "Begging your pardon, young man, but what's wrong with a lad your age being interested in toys? My grandson is about your size, and he'd be over the moon to have a knight like this one." George looked uncomfortable, clearly uncertain how to explain his situation without revealing their identities. Catherine could see him struggling with the collision between his father's teachings about maintaining dignity and his natural desire to simply be a child interested in a beautiful toy. "There's nothing wrong with it at all," Catherine said firmly, addressing both the vendor and her son. "George, if you like it, we can certainly get it for you." "Really?" The hope in George's voice was unmistakable, but so was the uncertainty. "What if someone sees me playing with it?" The vendor looked even more puzzled. "Son, the whole point of toys is to play with them. What good would it do sitting on a shelf?" Catherine made a decision that she knew might cause tension with William later, but felt necessary in that moment. "George, you're a little boy, and little boys should have toys they enjoy. If anyone has a problem with that, they can talk to me. The transformation in George's demeanor was immediate and heartbreaking. His careful posture relaxed, his face lit up with genuine excitement, and, for the first time in weeks, Catherine heard him laugh with pure, uninhibited joy as he examined the knight more closely, asking the vendor about how it was made and whether the carver had based it on a real historical knight. But, even as Catherine felt relief at seeing her son's natural personality emerge, she was acutely aware that this moment of freedom would need to be addressed with William. She could almost hear his concerns about photographs, about maintaining appropriate dignity, about the messages such casual behavior might send. The ride home was filled with the children's chatter about their market adventure. George clutched his wooden knight, occasionally making it gallop along the car window as he lost himself in imagination. Charlotte described every vegetable she'd seen in elaborate detail, while Louis fell asleep clutching a small bag of cookies they'd bought from a local baker. Catherine found herself dreading the conversation she would need to have with William about the morning's events. She knew he would see her purchase of the toy as undermining his efforts to teach George appropriate behavior, but she also knew she couldn't continue watching their son lose his childhood piece by piece in service of an adult role he wouldn't need to assume for decades. When they returned to Amer Hall, William was waiting in his study, having finished his morning meetings. Catherine could see from his expression that he'd already heard about their market visit through the security team's routine reports. "Catherine, might I have a word?" William's tone was carefully controlled, but she could sense the tension beneath it. In his study, William closed the door and turned to face her. "I understand there was an incident at the market today." If by incident you mean George acting like a normal 10-year-old boy for the first time in weeks, then, yes. I mean George being photographed by several market visitors while playing with a toy in public. Catherine felt her defensive instincts rising. "And what exactly is wrong with a child having a toy?" "You know that's not the point. We've discussed this, Catherine. Every public appearance is an opportunity to demonstrate the dignity and composure that will be expected of him throughout his life. He's 10 years old, William. 10. When did we decide that being dignified was more important than being happy?" William moved to stand behind his desk, a gesture that Catherine recognized as his way of creating emotional distance when conversations became difficult. "This isn't about happiness versus dignity. It's about preparing him for a role that won't allow for the luxury of spontaneous, unconsidered behavior." "The luxury?" Catherine's voice rose slightly before she caught herself. "We're talking about the luxury of childhood, of being allowed to experience wonder and joy without constant self-consciousness. And I'm talking about the reality of what his life will become. Every photograph, every public moment will be analyzed and judged. If we allow him to think that casual, childish behavior is acceptable now, how will he adapt when suddenly it isn't?" Catherine could see the genuine concern in William's eyes, the love for their son that drove his rigid expectations. But she could also see the shadow of his own childhood, the weight of early responsibility that had shaped his view of what preparation meant. "What if we're wrong?" she asked quietly. "What if by focusing so intensely on preparing him to be king, we forget to help him become the kind of person who should be king?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if the best preparation we can give him is the experience of genuine human connection, of understanding what it feels like to be truly happy, of knowing what he's meant to protect and serve? How can he represent the people if he's never been allowed to be one of them?" William was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see him wrestling with the question. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but still troubled. "My grandmother used to say that the crown requires sacrifice. That personal desires must always be secondary to duty. And your grandmother also said, near the end of her life, that she sometimes wondered what it would have been like to make different choices. She loved her role, but she also carried the weight of paths not taken." "You're suggesting we set George up to have regrets?" "I'm suggesting we give him enough authentic experience of life to make informed choices about how he wants to serve when the time comes. I'm suggesting we trust that a child who knows genuine happiness will grow into an adult capable of bringing that same authenticity to his role." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Come in," William called. George entered hesitantly, still carrying his wooden knight. "Papa, I wanted to show you something." William's expression softened as he looked at his son, and Catherine could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. Here was his beloved child, eyes bright with excitement, wanting to share something that had brought him joy. "What is it, George?" George held up the wooden knight, his enthusiasm overcoming his usual careful restraint. "The man who made this told me about the real knights it's based on. He said they were brave not just because they followed rules, but because they cared about protecting people. He said the best knights were the ones who remembered what they were fighting for." The simple wisdom of the child's words hung in the air between his parents, carrying a weight that neither had expected. Catherine watched as William looked at their son, really looked at him, perhaps seeing for the first time how the boy's natural intelligence and empathy might be stifled rather than shaped by too rigid an approach to his development. In that moment, Catherine saw a flicker of possibility, a chance that the conversation she and William needed to have about their son's future might take a different direction than she had feared. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but Catherine began to notice small shifts in the days following George's wooden knight revelation. William seemed to be watching their son with new eyes, paying attention not just to how George carried himself or spoke in formal situations, but to the moments when his natural personality shone through. The real test came during George's birthday celebration the following month. Traditionally, the family marked the children's birthdays with two celebrations: a private family gathering and a more formal occasion with photographs for the public. This year, William suggested something different. "What if we invited some of George's school friends for an actual party?" he proposed during one of their evening discussions. Nothing too elaborate, just children being children. Catherine felt a surge of hope but tried to keep her expression neutral. "Are you sure? What about the security concerns, the protocol issues?" "We'll manage those. I've been thinking about what you said, about George needing to understand what it means to be connected to people. Maybe that starts with being connected to other children his age." The party planning became a family project in a way that felt genuinely new for them. Instead of palace staff managing every detail, Catherine and William found themselves discussing games and cake flavors and whether they should hire entertainment or simply let the children create their own fun. George's excitement was palpable but careful, as if he couldn't quite believe this departure from normal royal protocol was really happening. "Are you certain Papa won't mind if we get loud?" he asked Catherine multiple times. "What if the other children don't know how to behave properly?" "George," Catherine said gently, sitting down beside him in his room the night before the party, "tomorrow is about you having fun with your friends. It's not about anyone behaving properly except in the most basic sense of being kind to each other." "But what if someone takes pictures? Papa always says we need to think about how things will look in photographs." Catherine felt the familiar pang at how much adult concern her 10-year-old carried. "Your Papa and I have talked about that. We want you to enjoy your birthday. Really enjoy it." The day of the party, Catherine watched from the morning room window as William supervised the setup in their private garden. He was personally checking the arrangements for the games, ensuring that the security measures were unobtrusive, and she could see him making mental notes about sight lines and potential issues. When the first guests arrived, Catherine felt her own nervousness spike. These were children from George's school, bright and energetic 10 and 11-year-olds who had no idea they were attending a royal birthday party. To them, George was simply their classmate, and Catherine realized how precious and fragile that normalcy was. The early part of the party proceeded cautiously. George introduced his friends to his parents with careful formality, and the children seemed slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur of their surroundings. Catherine could see William watching everything closely, and she wondered if he was regretting this departure from their usual controlled approach. Then, something magical happened. One of George's friends, a boy named Thomas, spotted the family's two dogs running in the garden and exclaimed with delight, "George, you didn't tell us you had spaniels. My grandmother has one just like that." The dogs, thrilled by new attention, bounded over to the group of children, and the formal atmosphere dissolved as the boys and girls began playing with them, laughing and shouting as the dogs chased after thrown sticks. George hesitated for just a moment, glancing toward his father, and Catherine held her breath. Then, William did something that surprised her completely. He smiled, a genuine, unreserved smile, and said, "Go on, George. They're your guests and your dogs." The change in George was instantaneous. His careful posture melted away as he joined his friends, and, for the next several hours, Catherine watched her son simply be a child among children. He got grass stains on his clothes, his hair became disheveled from running, and his laughter carried across the garden without any self-consciousness about who might hear it. But what moved Catherine most was watching William's reaction to this transformation. She could see him taking in every moment, from George's uninhibited joy to the easy camaraderie he shared with his friends. When one of the children fell and scraped his knee, George immediately rushed to help, showing genuine concern and kindness that needed no formal instruction. "He's quite natural at that, isn't he?" William murmured to Catherine as they watched George comfort his friend and help him to where Catherine could clean and bandage the scrape. "He always has been. He gets that from you, you know." William looked surprised. "From me?" "Your instinct to care for people, to want to help. It's one of the things that will make him a good king someday. But not because he was taught it as a protocol. Because he feels it genuinely." As the party continued, Catherine noticed William becoming more relaxed, even joining in some of the games when the children insisted. She watched him laugh as he was thoroughly defeated at football by a group of 10-year-olds, and saw how the children responded to his genuine enjoyment of their company. The real revelation came during the cake ceremony. Instead of the formal presentation Catherine had expected, the children had somehow turned it into a chaotic, joyful celebration with singing that was more enthusiastic than melodic, and George blowing out candles while surrounded by friends who were genuinely happy to be celebrating with him. "Make a wish, George," one of his friends called out, and Catherine saw her son close his eyes with the serious concentration that children bring to birthday wishes. Later, as the party wound down and guests were collected by their parents, Catherine overheard conversations that warmed her heart. The children thanked George for inviting them, told him it had been the best party ever, and made plans to reciprocate with their own celebrations. "Your son is a lovely boy," one of the mothers told Catherine. "Thomas has been looking forward to this party for weeks. George has been such a good friend to him at school." After the last guest had left and the family had retreated to their private sitting room, George collapsed onto the sofa with the satisfied exhaustion of a child who had truly enjoyed himself. "Did you have a good time?" Catherine asked, settling beside him. "The best time ever," George said, then looked toward his father with sudden uncertainty. "Was it all right, Papa? I know I got quite loud, and my clothes are rather messy." William sat down on George's other side, his expression tender. "It was perfect, George. Absolutely perfect." "Really?" "Really. I saw how kind you were to your friends, how you made sure everyone felt included, how you helped Thomas when he was hurt. Those are the qualities that will make you a good leader someday." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes as she watched the relief and happiness spread across George's face. This was the conversation she had been hoping for, the moment when William might begin to see that preparing their son for leadership didn't require stripping away his essential humanity. That evening, after George had been tucked into bed still clutching his wooden knight and chattering about the day's adventures, Catherine and William sat together in their room discussing the day's events. "I learned something today," William said quietly. Watching George with his friends, seeing how naturally he connected with them, how instinctively kind and inclusive he was. "I realized that those qualities can't be taught through formal instruction." "No," Catherine agreed. "They grow from experience, from being allowed to develop genuine relationships, from understanding what it feels like to simply be human." "I've been so focused on preparing him for the weight of responsibility that I forgot to help him develop the heart that will make that responsibility meaningful." Catherine reached for his hand. "It's not too late. he's still so young, and today showed that his natural instincts are beautiful. We just need to trust them more. William was quiet for a moment, then said, I keep thinking about something one of his friends said to me today. When I asked him what he liked about George, he said, he's just really nice, and he always tries to make sure nobody feels left out. That's not something that comes from protocol training. That's something that comes from being raised with love and being allowed to experience the world in a way that develops empathy. I want him to keep that. Whatever else we teach him about duty and responsibility, I want him to keep that essential kindness. Catherine felt a deep sense of relief and hope. The conversation they were having felt like a turning point, a moment when they might find a way to honor both George's future role and his present need to simply be a beloved child. But, even as she felt optimistic about this shift in William's perspective, Catherine knew that changing long-established patterns would require ongoing attention and probably more difficult conversations. The pressure from outside their family, from advisors and traditional expectations about royal upbringing, would not disappear overnight. The real work was just beginning, but, for the first time in months, Catherine felt that they might be approaching it as true partners, united in wanting what was best for their son both as a future king and as a human being who deserved to experience the full richness of childhood. The weeks following George's birthday party brought both progress and new challenges as Catherine and William worked to implement their evolving approach to parenting their future king. The success of the celebration had given them both confidence that allowing George more authentic childhood experiences could coexist with preparing him for his eventual role, but translating that philosophy into daily practice proved more complex than either had anticipated. The first major test came during preparations for a significant royal engagement where George would make a public appearance alongside his parents. It was exactly the kind of formal occasion where William's traditional approach had previously dominated, with detailed briefings about proper behavior, appropriate responses, and the importance of maintaining royal dignity at all times. Catherine watched as William prepared for the conversation with George, noting the internal struggle playing out in her husband's demeanor. She could see him weighing his new understanding of their son's needs against deeply ingrained beliefs about royal protocol and preparation. Perhaps we could approach this differently, Catherine suggested gently as William gathered his usual stack of briefing notes about proper public behavior. What do you mean? Instead of focusing on what George shouldn't do, what if we talked about what he naturally does well and how those qualities will serve him in this situation? William paused, considering the suggestion. I'm not sure I follow. Remember at his party how naturally he made sure everyone felt included? How instinctively he helped when someone was hurt. Those same qualities will make him connect authentically with the people he meets during this engagement. When they sat down with George to discuss the upcoming appearance, Catherine was relieved to see William taking a different approach than his usual formal briefing style. George, next week we'll be visiting a children's hospital together, William began. I thought we might talk about what that will be like. George nodded seriously. Should I prepare special things to say? Well, what would you want to talk about if you met other children who were in the hospital? George thought carefully. I'd probably want to know if they were feeling scared, and maybe tell them about things that made me feel better when I was worried about something. Catherine felt a surge of pride at her son's natural empathy, and she could see William recognizing the same thing. That sounds like exactly the right instinct, William said. The children we meet might be dealing with some difficult things, and I think your natural kindness will mean a lot to them. But, what about the cameras and the people watching? You always say I need to be careful about how things look. William glanced at Catherine, and she could see him wrestling with how to balance his traditional concerns with their new understanding. You're right that there will be cameras, he said finally. But, I think the most important thing is that you be genuinely yourself. The people watching want to see who you really are, not a performance of who you think you should be. The conversation continued with William sharing stories from his own childhood visits to hospitals, focusing on the meaningful connections he'd made rather than the protocol he'd followed. Catherine watched George's posture relax as the discussion shifted from rules to relationships, from performance to genuine human interaction. However, not everyone in their circle was comfortable with this evolving approach. A few days later, Catherine found herself in an uncomfortable meeting with one of the senior palace advisors who had concerns about what he saw as a loosening of standards in George's preparation. "Your Royal Highness," the advisor said with careful diplomacy, "there have been some observations about recent changes in Prince George's public appearances and preparation." "What kind of observations?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she knew where this conversation was heading. "There's been noted informality in his posture, increased spontaneity in his interactions, and what some have characterized as a less disciplined approach to public engagement protocols." Catherine felt her protective instincts rising. "Are you saying that George appearing more natural and connected with people is problematic?" "I'm saying that there are established protocols for royal children for very good reasons. The public expects a certain level of dignity and formality from members of the royal family, even the younger ones. And I would argue that the public also expects authenticity and genuine human connection, especially from children." The advisor's discomfort was evident. Perhaps this is a conversation that should include the Prince of Wales. That evening, Catherine discussed the meeting with William, watching carefully for his reaction to the external pressure to return to more traditional approaches. "They're concerned that we're being too casual," she explained. "They think George needs more formal structure, not less." William was quiet for a long moment. "What do you think?" "I think they're afraid of change, even change that might ultimately serve both George and the monarchy better." "But what if they're right? What if we're being naive about what's required for his future role?" Catherine could hear the uncertainty in William's voice, the way external pressure was causing him to second-guess their recent progress. She knew this was a crucial moment in their evolving approach to parenting George. "Let me ask you something," she said. "When you think about the monarchs or leaders who have been most beloved and effective, what qualities did they have?" "Dignity, certainly. A sense of duty, dedication to service. And?" William thought more deeply. "Authenticity. The ability to connect with people genuinely. Wisdom that comes from understanding human nature." "And how do you develop those last qualities?" "Through experience. Through genuine relationships. Through being allowed to develop naturally while being guided toward understanding your responsibilities." Catherine could see William working through the logic, reconnecting with the insights that had emerged from George's birthday party. "I think," William said slowly, "that we need to trust our instincts as parents, even when they conflict with traditional royal approaches." The hospital visit the following week proved to be a turning point that validated their evolving philosophy. Instead of the carefully scripted interactions that had characterized previous formal appearances, George was encouraged to follow his natural instincts in connecting with the children and staff they met. Catherine watched with deep pride as her son moved through the pediatric ward with genuine interest and compassion. When he met a young girl who was shy about speaking to him, he didn't fall back on formal conversation starters. Instead, he noticed a drawing she had been working on and asked about the story behind it. The natural conversation that followed was far more meaningful than any protocol-driven exchange could have been. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine observed how the experience affected George himself. Rather than the careful tension that usually characterized his public appearances, he seemed energized by the genuine connections he was making. She could see him gaining confidence not from following rules perfectly, but from discovering that his authentic self was actually quite capable of representing his family with dignity and warmth. The media response to the visit was overwhelmingly positive, with commentators noting George's natural ease and genuine warmth. More importantly, the hospital staff and families they met expressed genuine appreciation for what they described as an unusually authentic and meaningful royal visit. "He wasn't performing being a prince," one of the nurses told Catherine privately. "He was just being a lovely, caring boy who happens to be a prince." It made all the difference. That evening, as they debriefed the day's events as a family, George's excitement was palpable. "Mummy, Papa, I felt like I actually helped some of those children feel better," he said. Not because I said the right things, but because I really listened to them and cared about their stories. William's response carried a weight of recognition and pride. That's exactly what good leadership looks like, George. Not performing a role, but genuinely caring about the people you serve. The success of the hospital visit provided ammunition for Catherine and William to resist pressure from advisors who favored more traditional approaches. When similar concerns were raised in subsequent meetings, they could point to concrete evidence that their evolving methods were producing better outcomes both for George's development and for the public perception of the royal family. But, perhaps most importantly, Catherine began to see a different quality emerging in George himself. The careful, constrained child who had been so worried about making mistakes was gradually being replaced by a more confident, authentic young person who understood that his value came not from perfect performance but from genuine care for others. The shift wasn't complete, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. But Catherine felt that they had found a path forward that honored both George's future responsibilities and his present need to develop into the kind of person who could carry those responsibilities with wisdom, compassion, and authenticity. As she watched her family that evening, Catherine felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they had taken together and optimism about the young man George was becoming. The balance they were learning to strike between preparation and childhood, between duty and authenticity, felt sustainable in a way that their previous approach had not. The real test would be maintaining this balance as George grew older and the external pressures intensified, but Catherine felt confident that they had established a foundation strong enough to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. 6 months after the hospital visit that had marked such a significant shift in their approach, Catherine found herself reflecting on the profound changes that had taken place within their family dynamics. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but rather a gradual evolution that had touched every aspect of how they approached George's development and their own roles as parents preparing a child for an extraordinary destiny. The most noticeable change was in George himself. The careful, overly controlled child who had worried constantly about making mistakes had grown into a more confident and authentically engaged young person. He still understood the weight of his future responsibilities, but that understanding was now balanced with a genuine sense of self-worth that didn't depend on perfect performance. During a recent family dinner, Catherine had observed a moment that crystallized this transformation for her. Charlotte had been telling an animated story about a school project, and, instead of sitting quietly and formally as he might have months earlier, George had jumped in with enthusiasm, adding his own related experiences and asking questions that showed genuine interest in his sister's activities. When William gently reminded him about table manners, George had adjusted his posture naturally without the anxiety that such corrections used to provoke. More importantly, he had continued his engaged participation in the conversation, demonstrating that he could maintain appropriate behavior without sacrificing his authentic personality. "I've been thinking about our conversation from months ago," William said to Catherine one evening as they walked through their private gardens at Kensington Palace. "About finding balance between preparation and childhood." "What about it?" "I think I was afraid that if I didn't prepare George for every possible challenge, I would be failing him as a father. But I've come to understand that the most important preparation I can give him is helping him become someone worth following." Catherine smiled, hearing the wisdom that had emerged from their journey together. "And how do you think we're doing with that?" "I think we're helping him become someone I would be proud to follow, regardless of his title." This shift in perspective had influenced not just their approach to George's development, but their relationship with Charlotte and Louis as well. The lessons they had learned about balancing preparation with authentic childhood experience were being applied more broadly, creating a family environment where all 3 children could develop their natural personalities while understanding their unique circumstances. Charlotte, in particular, had benefited from this more relaxed approach. Her natural confidence and curiosity had been allowed to flourish without constant correction, and she was developing into a poised but genuinely spirited young person who could represent her family with both dignity and authenticity. Louis, still young enough to be largely exempt from formal expectations, had nonetheless benefited from the reduced tension in family dynamics. Catherine noticed that he was more open and communicative, less likely to withdraw when conversations turned serious, and more willing to express his own thoughts and feelings. The changes had not gone unnoticed by the broader royal household and media. Comments about the family's increased naturalness in public appearances had been overwhelmingly positive, with observers noting that the children seemed more engaged and authentic in their interactions with the public. More importantly, feedback from the institutions and charities they visited consistently praised the children's genuine interest and meaningful connections with the people they met. George, in particular, was developing a reputation for thoughtful questions and authentic concern that went far beyond his years. A particularly meaningful validation of their approach came during a visit to a youth center in London. George had been speaking with a group of teenagers about their experiences and aspirations, and Catherine had watched with pride as her son demonstrated genuine curiosity about their perspectives and challenges. One of the young people, a girl about Charlotte's age, had asked George directly, "What's it like knowing you'll be king someday? Does it make you feel different from other people?" Instead of falling back on a prepared response, George had thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes it feels heavy, like there's a lot to live up to. But my parents have helped me understand that the most important thing is caring about people and trying to help when I can. I think that's something anyone can do, whether they're going to be king or not." The simplicity and authenticity of his response had clearly resonated with the young people, and several had continued the conversation with questions about how they could make a difference in their own communities. Later, one of the youth workers had approached Catherine privately. "I've seen a lot of royal visits over the years," she said. "Usually, they feel a bit artificial, like everyone's performing their roles. Today felt different. Your son was really listening and really caring. That's not something you can fake." These external validations were meaningful, but Catherine found even more significance in the changes she observed in her family's private moments. George's laughter came more easily now, and his questions reflected genuine curiosity rather than careful concern about giving correct answers. During a recent family game night, she had watched George lose graciously at a board game, then immediately suggest they play something that Louis might enjoy more. The natural leadership and consideration he displayed in these unguarded moments convinced Catherine that they were nurturing exactly the qualities that would serve him well in his future role. William's evolution as a father had been equally significant. The rigid adherence to protocol that had characterized his early approach to George's upbringing had been replaced by a more nuanced understanding of how to balance tradition with authentic development. "I realize now that I was trying to protect George from criticism by making him perfect," William confided to Catherine during one of their evening walks. "But I was actually making him more vulnerable by preventing him from developing the genuine confidence that comes from being accepted for who he truly is." The shift had also strengthened William's own relationship with their son. Instead of interactions dominated by instruction and correction, their time together now included genuine conversations about George's interests, concerns, and observations about the world around him. Catherine often found them engaged in discussions that ranged from historical questions sparked by George's studies to philosophical conversations about leadership and responsibility that showed remarkable depth for a child his age. Perhaps most importantly, George had begun to show signs of developing his own perspective on what kind of leader he wanted to become. During a conversation about a particularly inspiring documentary they had watched together, he had said, "I think the best leaders are the ones who remember what it feels like to need help." The wisdom in that simple statement had moved both Catherine and William, representing as it did the kind of empathy and understanding that could only develop through genuine human experience. As Catherine looked toward the future, she felt cautiously optimistic about the foundation they were building for George's eventual role. The balance they had found between preparing him for extraordinary responsibilities while allowing him to develop as a complete human being felt sustainable and authentic. There would undoubtedly be new challenges as George grew older and the external pressures intensified. The teenage years would bring their own complications, and the eventual transition to more formal royal duties would require careful navigation. But Catherine felt confident that they had established principles and practices that could adapt to whatever circumstances arose. Most importantly, they had learned to trust both George's natural instincts and their own parental wisdom, even when external voices suggested different approaches. The combination of authentic development and thoughtful preparation was creating exactly the kind of future leader Catherine believed the world needed. On a quiet Sunday morning, as she watched George playing enthusiastically with his siblings in the garden, Catherine felt a deep sense of peace about the choices they had made. Here was her son, future king, but also simply a beloved child who was growing into someone she genuinely admired. The wooden knight from the market still sat on George's bedside table, a reminder of the day when everything had begun to change. But it was no longer a symbol of conflict between childhood and preparation. Instead, it had become a representation of the possibility of being both authentic and noble, both human and royal, both a child and a future leader. That integration of seemingly opposing qualities felt like the greatest gift they could give George as he grew toward his destiny. Catherine knew that the journey was far from over, but she was confident they were traveling the right path together.